guess we're ready to start now. Sorry, just getting things in order. Got a lot on the board here for you to jot down. You might jot it down as we go through it, though, because I'll be filling in a lot of it as well. I think I don't remember. It's been a while since our last class, a whole 2 days, and lots has happened between our last meeting. So I'm pretty sure I told you to get started on Sartre, and I gave you a couple terms: being for itself, being in itself. I'll find it very surprising if we actually get to that stuff today. We probably won't even be able to get started on Sartre. We might get a little bit of a start on that reading. The reading is rather difficult for those of you who did attempt to do it. There's no response due for that reading. The next response will be on Sartre, but it'll be from one of your textbooks. I didn't bring it with me, and I don't see any of you with. Oh, you got it. Yes, that one right there. You're going to read the first chapter from that book and respond to that. And the assignment is available on the website. But that's probably going to be due in about a week, I'm thinking. Probably next class on Monday, we'll come in. We'll do the first reading for Sartre, which I hope I'm going to kind of lay the groundwork for that today. We'll get into that. We'll get through that. And then a week from today, we'll get started on that book that you've got there with you. And that will probably take us about a day and a half. So. Response is due a week from today, so Wednesday of next week. Yeah, that's what we'll have it. We'll see what happens. Maybe on Monday I might push it back even further. It depends on how much we get into the Sartre reading. But I'm thinking there should be no problem to get to it by this next Wednesday. But quite a few things that we need to discuss before we get into that Sartre reading. And maybe if you haven't started on it, maybe it's a good thing, because I think once you know a little bit more about Husserl and Heidegger, you'll probably be a little bit better equipped to understand that reading, even though you still might have problems. It is difficult. One of the things is he uses his own terminology, as I mentioned last time when I gave you those words, and we'll get a taste of this today when we go over Heidegger. So Heidegger is no different from Sartre. They're both engaged in phenomenology. They're both doing phenomenology, and so. Just by glancing at Sartre's reading, we can see how difficult phenomenology might be. So I'm going to try to clear things up a little bit about what exactly is phenomenology, what's going on with it, what are they trying to do, how is this approach any different than any other approach to philosophy. And we'll have to talk about Husserl in order to do that, because Husserl's the father of phenomenology. He's the one that develops this method, and so we'll have to talk a little bit about him. But before I do that, I want to at least give you some general remarks about the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. So now we're beyond Nietzsche. Nietzsche dies in 1900. Here we are a little bit closer to home. And many philosophers see this as a moment of crisis, particularly because of people like Nietzsche and people like Kierkegaard, who do such a good job of bludgeoning reason, if you will. They kind of make it look like reason is overrated. Reason cannot do all the things that philosophy has promised us that it could do. And so we're at this moment of crisis, and we have to sort of pick up the pieces and move forward and see what we can do. And so there are various responses to this. And it's not just in philosophy, I think, where things are getting a little bit weird, but throughout all of the arts, in music, in literature, in theater, there's all sorts of experimentation going on in the early part of the century, right? Maybe some of you are familiar. I see a lot of you are music students. Perhaps some of you are familiar with some of the works of people like John Cage or Stravinsky. You know about John Cage? Yeah, 433. What's 433? 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, right? This is the time period. Well, what's that? Every performance is different, right? Because every performance is, and so John Cage is asking us to kind of throw out the typical rules of composition and think of other things besides what we've been thinking about as instruments, as music, right? I guess the world is a symphony, as maybe his point that he's trying to make, right? You get people like Stravinsky who are doing some pretty risque stuff, but nothing like quite as far out as someone like Cage, right? But philosophy is no different, right? Some radical views get put forward, some radical considerations of how we approach these questions. And a lot of people, they trace back this big divide in philosophy. They can trace it back to this time period. I think this rift in the tradition, it continues to this day. You have these two big factions of philosophy. One group is named the Analytic Philosophy tradition, the other is Continental Philosophy, and I hate to call them schools of thought because that makes you think they all, if I'm an analytic philosopher, I agree with all other analytic philosophers, and if I'm Continental, then they must all agree on the issues. It's not really that cut and dry. It's more like these are more like traditions than they are schools of thought. It seems like at least since the early 20th century, maybe back even further, there's been two different approaches to philosophy, and they very rarely see eye to eye. To me, really, the major differences seem to be just stylistic. The way that they write, the analytic philosophers tend to be a little bit more technical. They try to be as clear as they can about their terms and things like that. They're very methodical. I guess that's where they get the name analytic. That's one of the reasons we might call them analytic. And the Continental, they seem to be more literary in their approach. Right? The analytic philosophers, at least the earlier ones, tended to focus on logic, mathematics, science, language, whereas the Continental philosophers dealt usually with more social issues, political things, political issues. But I hate to keep saying all this stuff because both camps are really hard to categorize. One thing is safe to say, they usually don't take each other very seriously. If I'm an analytic philosopher, typically I'm going to dismiss anything that's continental, and if I'm continental, I'm going to dismiss any analytic. There are some rare exceptions. I guess I consider myself a bit of a continental philosopher. I have continental leanings, but I appreciate both schools, or I call them schools. I appreciate both traditions. There's good work on both sides. It gets a little frustrating for me. Most English-speaking universities, if they have a big philosophy department, it's typically analytic, right? So analytic philosophy is very dominant in the Anglo world, right? The Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American world, right? The British Isles, Australia, United States, and all that, Canada. Whereas continental philosophers are typically European, Germany, and I guess that's where the title continental comes from, the European continent, right? We're not going to do we're not going to focus hardly on any analytics. In fact, I used to talk about Wittgenstein a bit. We would come back to him at the end of the semester. From this point on, we're kind of just going to follow the split down this side. I wish I could go back to Wittgenstein and talk a little bit about him. He's a very interesting philosopher, and I put a question mark next to his name because although people refer to him as an analytic philosopher, he's one of those rare figures that actually enjoys a bit of influence on both sides of the aisle. But I'm going to move on from this and talk just about continental, but perhaps I should say at least a couple things about Frege and Russell, just to give you an idea of what they were doing and why it was maybe different from what Husserl and Heidegger and what Sartre were doing. But Frege and Russell, they were big into mathematics, right? Particularly Frege. The guy was really a mathematician and a logician, and so they were focusing on logic. And I think we should, we should at least consider their contributions to logic because they're so important. Logic itself, right, this study of reasoning, what constitutes good reasoning, logic itself hadn't really changed much at all since Aristotle. So we've got over 2,000 years where nothing really has been developed. Now, some things have been added. It's been improved a little bit, kind of in the medieval period. But there's a lot of holes in this logic. It's not as strong as it should be. And we can thank people like Frege and Russell for developing a much more sophisticated logic. And this logic that they developed, it has practical applications. I mean, a lot of the logic that they were talking about and they were using and developing, same thing that we use to program our computers with today. So, again, it's not just a bunch of nerds thinking about numbers and stuff. It actually has practical applications. But both Frege and Russell seem to have this idea, they had this belief that you could take language, you could take mathematics, and you could boil it down to simple parts, simple constitutive parts. So Frege, for instance, might say that when you look at the symbol for addition, you see a plus sign, that this would be a simple component of language that really couldn't be defined. You couldn't give it a definition. You have to just see how that symbol works in certain operations. And once you've used it and seen it at work in a few operations, you have this idea or this notion of addition. And it's just intuitive. It's self-evident. And so Frege and Russell, they believe that knowledge, language, mathematics could be boiled down to these simple parts, these atoms of knowledge, I guess, right, that were supposedly self-evident. And all other knowledge could be derived from those simple component parts, right? That was sort of their approach, but most analytic philosophers have abandoned that. They don't really believe that you can boil information down to these units, right? That all knowledge is contextual or holistic, right? And so that's another reason why I think the name analytic philosophy is inappropriate. Most of them don't believe you can do this type of logical analysis, right? But that was their focus, right? Mathematics, language, and perhaps a little bit in science. Now, Husserl, we're going over to the Continental side, Husserl is also dealing with this crisis of reason. Philosophy seems to have failed us in the past. What do we want out of it? We want truth. And it doesn't seem like we've been getting very far towards that goal. We need to make philosophy a rigorous science, Husserl says. So far, it hasn't been able to do this, to make itself into a rigorous science. And he thinks if he can develop a method of doing philosophy that is rigorous, that he can somehow address this problem. Now, like I said, the method that he comes up with is phenomenology. And a lot of people, a lot of philosophers that don't know any better, they tend to think of phenomenology as anti-science, right? As a rejection of science. And I don't really think that that's the case. I think that certainly Husserl does not think that phenomenology is the same thing as natural science. And he doesn't think that philosophy is doing the same thing that science is doing. But I think he actually kind of had an admiration for science, because at least in the sciences, there's a more or less agreed upon method for how to do them. If I'm a physicist and I make a discovery and I publish a paper about my findings, any other physicist anywhere in the world can read my paper in some journal and try to replicate the experiment to verify it. There's no such method in philosophy, right? When Husserl looks back, he thinks that, well, it seems like in philosophy the opposite is true. Every new philosopher that comes along kind of starts over, right? You get Plato, and Plato gives us his theory of forms. And then here comes Aristotle. No, that's wrong. We've got to start over. This is the way to do it, right? And then Aristotle works for a few generations. And then we get the scientific revolution. Oh, no, got to start over again, says Descartes, right? Then Descartes' wrong. Now Hume's the guy who's right. No, it's Kant. No, now it's Hegel. Edmund Husserl says we've got to stop this. We've got to have at least this uniform method that all philosophers can agree on, so we can have perpetual progress like you have in the sciences. Yeah?
And they develop different viewpoints because that's what it is. That's how it comes from their own lives, and they live during different periods of time.
So philosophy, by its very nature, you think should have to be like this? Yeah, maybe you're right, and maybe Husserl's naive to think that it shouldn't be otherwise, right? But he wants to think that we can come up with a method. Perhaps the results of our use of this method will differ, and we'll always be able to argue, like scientists do, right? We have only a limited amount of data to work with. We've got many ways to explain that data, right? We have many theories that we can use to explain what happens, and so there's always some room for arguments in science. But at least science has ways of experimenting and verifying and things like that. And he thinks that, oh, you're going to say, well, no, it doesn't. Sure. But again, there are ways of verifying a theory of physics. maybe not quantum mechanics or things like that. I mean, you're thinking of all these wild examples, but if I want to prove that water freezes at 32 degrees, I'd put water in a room and I'd turn the temperature down to below 32 degrees and I'd see what happens, right? And sure, maybe that's an illusion by the evil demon or whatever, right? But it's still something I can see and verify with my senses, and we can argue about whether those are reliable or not, but science takes them as so. Now, Husserl doesn't want to approach things like that, okay, because he's a philosopher. And so, and I think that's why people think of phenomenology as anti-science, is because of his criticisms of what he calls the natural standpoint or the scientific attitude. That it's this sort of naive belief in those external things, right? That you take them for granted that they're there. The phenomenologist cannot do this, right? But what does the phenomenologist do? If he's not doing science, if he's not analyzing things the way a scientist analyzes things, then how does the phenomenologist analyze things? Well, first off, what do they analyze? Phenomenology looks at phenomena. That's a plural. The plural for the word phenomenon. Phenomena. What does that word mean, though? What is a phenomenon? An occurrence. Right. Don't get confused. People use the word phenomenal, like amazing or something. But no, a phenomenon, it's a very empty kind of word. It just means something that happened, an occurrence, right? So phenomena is just the plural of phenomenon, things that happen. Phenomenology examines things that happen. And so, doesn't science examine things that happen? I mean, aren't there other things that do this? What makes phenomenology different? How is its approach any different? Well, one thing about it, Husserl says, is that before we go around explaining certain phenomena, we have to perform an epoche. He uses this Greek word, epoche, which means bracketing. We have to bracket. We have to, when I bracket something, I put the brackets around it, I set it aside. Well, what is he setting aside here? Husserl wants us to bracket any metaphysical concerns for the phenomena, right? So if I'm doing a phenomenology and I'm talking about, I'm having an experience of a table. I'm looking at it, right? I need to analyze that phenomenon of looking at tables, right? I might do that as a phenomenologist. But I couldn't ask questions like, what's causing me to see the table? Is there really a table out there that's causing me to see it? Husserl would say, forget that. You've got to bracket those concerns. Don't worry about that. We know you're seeing a table. You can't deny the experience of it. So let's just deal with that alone and try to understand it from that perspective without asking what causes it. Is it real or an illusion? Well, maybe it is an illusion or maybe it's real, but I can't deny that I'm having the experience of it. So let's just focus on that and brush away or set aside any metaphysical concerns. We're going to bracket those. We're going to perform that epoche. On the other hand, I can't take the other viewpoint, the other extreme. I can't take what Husserl calls the natural standpoint, or sometimes the scientific attitude. And that's where I take for granted the existence of those external things. Like when I'm on the highway driving and I see a car coming straight for me, right? I don't ask myself, is this real or an illusion, right? I just assume that, yes, this is a real car and I'm going to move out of the way, right? So I don't ask metaphysical questions, but I also don't make metaphysical assertions either. Well, then what the heck is left for me to do? Husserl says I should provide a description of the experience. I can describe the experience that I'm having. I can describe the phenomenon. And then I can do an eidetic reduction, another fancy term that he comes up with. I can do eidetic reduction. What does that mean? It comes from the Greek word eidos or eidos. We saw this with Plato. That's the word that he uses for form, right? When we get to Husserl, it usually gets translated as essence. So we take that phenomenon and we reduce it to its essence. We perform an eidetic reduction. So a simple example. Let's say we're doing phenomenology and we're trying to explain the phenomenon of a house. When I have an experience of a house, I'm standing in front of this building, I call it a house. what is the essence of that phenomenon, house? Well, for Husserl, I first provide this description, this phenomenal description, the qualities that I see, and then I start to reduce those qualities. I start to take some of them away. I say, well, if I took the sidewalk away, and the front yard, and the driveway, would it still be a house? Would it still be a house? Yeah, right? No yard, but still a house. If it was made out of wood instead of brick, would it still be a house? Yeah, so obviously a yard and a driveway and a sidewalk aren't part of the essence of a house, and neither is brick or whatever material it's made out of. That's not part of its essence. What if I took all the windows away and there's no windows? It'd be a house without windows, so I guess windows aren't essential either. They're not a part of that essence of house. What if I took away all the doors and there was no way to get in it or out of it? It was just this hollow structure. Would it still be a house?
Yeah.
You think so? I don't think so.
It doesn't have a door.
But what if you can't get into it? There's no chimney or nothing. It's just like a building that's like got a hollow square middle.
Are you talking about when they just put the boards up?
No, not the frame. I'm saying like they took a house, let's say, and they sealed it all off. They sealed it all off.
Oh, with no doors. I thought you just said take the doors.
Oh no, that's that guy. That confused my other class. No, so there's no entry. You can't get into it or out of it. Is it still a house? It's a cave. Maybe it's not even that. You can at least try to crawl into a cave. So maybe we have to have, I think it's essential for a house that it's a place where you can dwell, where you can have shelter. And if you have shelter in a house, you're gonna have to get inside of it, right? You don't agree with me, that's fine, but go ahead.
What if they build a house around you? It fit everything you just say you dwell in it, but it would have no doors. So
Well, I would dwell in it for just as long as I starve to death, I guess, right? Yeah, so it would be a temporary house, but when I died, it'd be my tomb instead, right? Become a tomb. But we could argue about what is a house and what isn't. I'm just trying to explain what phenomenologists do. That's the kind of thing that they look at a particular phenomenon, they try to reduce it to its essence, and I use the example of a house because it's easier, okay? Husserl did not waste his time talking about houses, okay? He was talking about things, his main concern was consciousness. Right? That was exactly. Whoa.
That would be more complicated.
That was much more complicated, right? But he thought it was the most important thing for a phenomenologist to analyze. I have to deal with this. Why? Because any phenomenon that I speak of always takes place in my consciousness, right? And so I need to get clear about the structures of consciousness, the essence of consciousness. What is it? How does it work? These sort of things. So Husserl was very concerned with this. And his short answer to the question, what is consciousness? He says, well, consciousness is this thing, it always has this quality of intentionality. This word he uses, intentionality. Consciousness is always intentional. And he didn't make this up. This is actually an idea he borrows from another philosopher named Brentano. Brentano is the one that said consciousness is intentional. And for Husserl, what that means is that consciousness is always, in all cases, it's always consciousness of something as something. So, when I'm standing in front of the house, I'm conscious of the materials, the colors, the shapes that I'm looking at. I'm conscious of all these qualities, but they're always structured as a certain type of thing. It's not just brick and window and roof, it's a house. Right now I'm having this experience of desks and pens and books and students and chairs and all these different colors and shapes. But it's all structured as a certain type of thing, as a classroom. Right? So for Husserl, that's how it always is. My consciousness is always structured like this. So when I'm conscious of something, the raw data, the inputs, but those inputs are always structured as a particular type of thing. They have some essence to them. House, classroom, whatever, right? And so that's about all I want to say about Husserl. Before we move on to Heidegger, though, aren't there other things too, perhaps, that we have to explain? What about other people? The phenomenon of other people. experiencing a house, I can just talk about qualities that I see. And maybe I do have to refer to qualities that I don't see, right? Like when I look at a house, I also assume there's a back to it, right? That there's sides and a back and all that. I don't see it, but Husserl will say I apperceive it. It's in that idea, right? A house has a back, right? Even though I'm not looking at it, I know it's there, right? Because that's a part of the idea. But what about other people? When I see you, I mean, how would I describe that experience? For Husserl, this is a big deal. I've got to deal with it because he doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want to talk about objectivity, because if you talk about objectivity, for Husserl, you're making metaphysical assumptions. You're saying, when you say something's objective, that everybody knows it's true, it's an objective fact, that's making a metaphysical assertion, that there's this world out there that's real, that all people have access to. So he avoids words like objectivity, but instead, he crosses this out and he speaks of intersubjectivity. So it's kind of like this idea, if I'm looking at the house, right, and I see somebody walking towards me and they stand right next to me and they look at the house, I assume that they're seeing more or less the same thing, maybe from a slightly different angle or something. If I'm looking at somebody on some field, I'm looking outside on this soccer field, right, and a big gust of wind comes by and I see some guy shivering out there, right? I'm assuming he feels cold, right? And if I were out there, that I would be feeling the similar thing that he's feeling. So for Husserl, I know the other person by this analogy. I look at the way they behave. I don't perceive their subjectivity, but I understand that the world is available to them as well. When I look at the schoolhouse, right, I know that in order for it to be a schoolhouse, there have to be students in there, or at least there will be on class days, right? That's what it means to be a schoolhouse. If there's no students, if there was no such thing as a student, would there be school? No. At least Husserl would say that, right? So that idea, that essence of schoolhouse includes the idea of another person. So we live in a world of other subjects, of intersubjectivity, as he puts it. This will be important when we get to the Sartre reading, because that seems to be what he focuses on more than anything else, at least in the section that I gave you of Sartre. He's trying to deal with this phenomenon of the other, not just the other as the other object. This desk is an other, it's not me, but that's different from the other person. And Sartre believes that Husserl and Heidegger, they leave something out of their account of the other, right? They talk about terms of just something, I see them, they're an object out there that is probably a person, not a robot. I believe they're real, they're a person. Sartre says that's one way that I encounter the other, but there's other ways that I encounter the other where I couldn't doubt that they're another subject. Sartre we're starting on next time, or maybe we're going to get started on it a little bit later today, right? That's what you're going to do your next response on. Not this next reading, but we were doing 2 readings for him.
I have a question.
Of course.
So what is the test going to be on? The next test will be
Everything after the second test. Everything since the second test. Nietzsche and afterwards. So Nietzsche and all this. Okay, so intersubjectivity, we'll see this again. In fact, Sartre uses that word. Nietzsche and after. That's everything after the second test. It's, some people mispronounce Sartre, but it's actually, I mispronounce it Sartre because I think that's less bad than Sartre. The French would say Sartre, but I'm not going to say Sartre every time. Sorry. Besides, my mouth's a little dry right now. I have to have some red wine, and then I can speak French a little bit better. No thanks. And then I can say Sartre. Well, let's move on to Heidegger, okay? Heidegger is very important, especially when it comes to Sartre, because he was very influential to Sartre, and not just Sartre, but to a lot of other philosophers after him. Some say Heidegger was the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. And Heidegger, he's often referred to as Husserl's student, but I don't think that's actually completely accurate. I mean, when... Any questions, or... So many people refer to Heidegger as a student of Husserl. I don't think that's fair. I mean, Heidegger studied with Husserl at the University of Heidelberg after he'd already gotten his doctorate, but he learned about phenomenology through Husserl. So Husserl was kind of like his intellectual father, and Heidegger was very impressed by this method of phenomenology. He wanted to use it for his own devices, and he publishes a book in 1927 called Sein und Zeit, and in German that means being in time, and he dedicates his book to his mentor, Edmund Husserl, and I'm sorry to say it, but Husserl is not very happy with this. In fact, Husserl reads the first page and immediately closes the book and just says, what a bunch of rubbish. He's pretty pissed off at Heidegger. In fact, he kind of feels a little bit betrayed. One thing with Heidegger, he wasn't so focused on consciousness. He thought that this was the wrong way to approach phenomenology. He liked phenomenology, but he thought that this analyzing consciousness was not what we need to do. In fact, even the word consciousness for Heidegger was wrong. It has too much metaphysical baggage, as he might say. We've been using it for so long that it has all these connotations to it. I always think of the ego or the self, this Cartesian cogito, remember Descartes' I think, this sort of isolated subject. And Heidegger wants to make this radical claim that this old way of thinking about the world in terms of me, the subject, the mind, versus the world out there, the object, right, that this is completely misguided, right, that this dualistic picture of the world is wrong, and that when we talk about the world and we talk about the self, we're really just getting two different names to the same thing. That the world and the self cannot be separated. And consciousness is a sort of misguided view. Thinking of things in terms of consciousness is a misguided view. For Heidegger, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he's really got it backwards. For Heidegger, I am, right, I have being, I exist, here I am in the world, and therefore I think. Then I start to carve out a sense of self, a sense of subjectivity, and ego, right? But at first I'm here, I have being. So being is primary for Heidegger, right? Not consciousness. But what were you going to say?
So it'd be like Hume all over again.
Not exactly Hume, because even Hume is slightly guilty of this bias that sees a self as something separate from the external world, right? There's this external world out there, and there's this me self that's completely isolated from that world. For Heidegger, I'm in the world. I'm submerged in it. I don't even have a sense of a self immediately. This is something that I have as a result of some experience, perhaps. And hold on, though. We'll get to this in a minute, right? We'll get to this in a minute. Back to this notion of being, though. Right? Husserl says consciousness is the primary concern of the phenomenologist. Heidegger says it's being. We have to answer this question of what is being? What does it mean to be? This is a question that Heidegger thinks philosophy has forgotten about. That they sort of glossed over it and left it behind. And Heidegger wants to resuscitate this question. What does it mean to be? Or he also asks, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are there beings rather than no beings at all? And being itself, he thinks it's this idea that we have this concept. We take it for granted, but we all have this sort of intuition about it. We all know what it means when we say that something is. When I say that this desk is, right, or that this marker is. It's something we just take for granted. It's so close, Heidegger says, that it's actually the furthest thing away, which is paradoxical, but it's almost like, think about your nose, right? It's so close, you can't really see it, right? Being is like this. Being is so close that we just take it for granted. We don't see it. But Heidegger wants to get a little bit of distance and be able to look at being, right, and analyze being. But he doesn't know where to begin at first. He says, I've got to start with one particular type of being and analyze it. And then I can maybe see what all the different beings have in common, right? And I can get at the broader question about being in general. And so he finally zeroes in on one particular type of being that he thinks is important. He consciousness. It's where he begins. Heidegger says that all of us are Dasein. We all are being there. That's literally what Dasein means. Sein is the German word for being, and da is a prefix that usually means there, sometimes here. So literally there being, or being there. And Heidegger defines Dasein, and this is really hard to swallow. I'll say it very slowly. He says that Dasein is the being who, in its very being, that being is an issue for it. Okay, so I'll repeat. Dasein is the being, the entity, the thing, who, in its very being, that being is an issue for it. So in its very being, just because it is the type of being that it is, its being is an issue for it. It asks the question, why am I being, right? Why am I here? Why am I being there instead of a nothing? And Heidegger thinks that that is something unique to Dasein. Other beings don't do this. A beaver, when they're building their dam, they don't ask about why they're doing it. Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? Right? Their being is not an issue for them. It is for us, though. That somehow has to be resolved. Why am I here? Why do I have being? Heidegger admits, though, that we typically don't like to ask that question to ourselves. In fact, we typically try to cover it up. We try to deny that our being is an issue for us, right? But that just proves that it is. We're spending so much time trying to cover it up, right? Because we don't want to face up to that fact. Did you comment or forgot? So we're all Dasein, right? We're all being there. Our being is an issue for us. We need to resolve that issue somehow. And how do we do this? How do we resolve that issue? Typically, we just go about our way. We do what one does. We go to school, we have a job, whatever, right? We have a career, we have distractions, right? And here's where I think Heidegger gets pretty interesting. This is where primarily in my everyday interactions, I'm not really thinking about what I'm doing or who I am, right? In fact, you might even say there is no me there yet. There is no self to inhabit my consciousness. You know, if when you got here today, we all walked through the door, right? You walked through this door to the classroom, and when you were walking through the door, were you thinking about walking through the door? You just did it, right? I mean, you weren't like walking to the door going, I'm walking to a door. In order to open doors, I have to turn the handle. In order to turn the handle, I have to grab it with my hand. In order to grab it with my hand, I have to bend my fingers. Then I twist the knob. Then I pull it out. Then I put one foot in front of the other. You're not thinking anything about I am doing this. I am doing that. You're not doing that. It's like you're on autopilot, right? You're transparently coping. There is no distinction between you and your world, right? You are your world. You're in the world, as Heidegger would say, right? As Heidegger puts it, when you're in the workshop, the carpenter, he's hitting the nail with the hammer. He is the hammer. There's no distinction between him and the tool that he's using. That hammer for Heidegger is now in the mode of the ready to hand. It's just there, ready to hand. I am the hammer. I pound the nail, right? It's just this transparent coping. It's like if you drive to work the same route every day, or on your drive home, or whatever, right? I know a lot of you might not be driving now, but you just get sort of used to that drive, and you're not really thinking. You're kind of just on autopilot, right? And sometimes I guess that gets you into trouble. I know it's gotten me into trouble. When I lived in Austin, I had two places to go usually, work or school, right? And the first about 2 miles of the trip was the same. But there's this one fork in the road where if I went this way, it was to school, went that way, it was to work. I don't know how many times I was just drifted to the wrong side, you know? And I realized that right after I did it, right? Oh, geez, I went the wrong way. It wasn't an easy fix either. You had to go back and read blogs. Heck, it was was even worse. I drove out to Spring about 2 semesters ago, and I was actually supposed to be driving to Stafford. Because I was just used to going to Spring, up there on 290. I was just used to going out there because I had that class the semester before. So I just woke up in the morning. It was like 8 o'clock. I was like, oh, geez, I got to be there soon. I don't have time to, take a shower, just brush my teeth, throw some clothes on, get out of there. And then I get to like the exit before my exit. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm supposed to be going to Stafford. But before that happened, there was no me. There was no I. There was no self. I was on autopilot. But as soon as I realized what I had done, there was the self. There was the subject. And, oh, I'm wrong. I did the wrong thing. I need to call HCC and tell them that I have a flat tire or something, right? Then the self emerges, right? Then the subjectivity emerges. Then I set myself against my world. When I'm in that workshop and I'm pounding the hammer, I am that hammer. Until maybe the hammer breaks. Well, and then now the hammer's broken, right? And now I can just look at it, and it no longer has that functionality that it had before. It no longer serves that purpose. It's no longer ready to hand. It's unready to hand, right? Now I can see it, Heidegger says, I can see it as a pure presence at hand. I see it without any function. It's just this thing with qualities. There it is. It's a hammer. It's hard. It doesn't work anymore. It's broken. I can detach myself from it and just analyze it in terms of its features, right? But this only happens. This is a fleeting moment, right? Heidegger says most of the time I don't really see things as present to hand. They're almost always in this mode of the ready to hand. When the hammer breaks, what do? I find a new hammer, right? Or I fix the old one, right? And then it becomes ready to hand again. I get back into the flow, right? And Heidegger says that there really is no such thing as an isolated piece of equipment. There's no such thing as an equipment or a tool. Every piece of equipment refers to another piece of equipment. Well, how does a hammer refer to another piece of equipment? What does it refer to?
The fact that you can become anything.
The carpenter?
If I am a carpenter and I'm using a hammer, how does the hammer not make sense in isolation? What else do you have to have if you got a hammer?
A nail.
You gotta have some nails, right? And the nails don't make sense without the hammer.
Without the hammer. Unless you use a high heel.
But then you're using the high heel as a hammer, right?
Okay.
But still, Heidegger would say it's going to be part of a referential totality. You have this workshop of a bunch of references that make up a totality, right? You've got the works, you've got the hammer, it goes with the nails, it goes with the boards. It all fits together, but you're not really aware of it while you're doing your work. But it's still there, or else you wouldn't be able to do your work, right? You're making you're being the carpenter or the cobbler making a shoe or something like that, and you're not thinking about the whole process, but yet you have an understanding of the whole process, right? It's there in your movements, right? You know what has to be done. You know what the task at hand is, but you don't picture it to yourself. You don't see the whole process, not until the hammer doesn't work. The hammer breaks down. Now that whole cycle has been sort of disrupted. Now you can stand back and analyze the whole thing, right? You see what's wrong. You see what's at fault, right? Then things become present at hand, right? And, like if I'm going to the door and I can't get through the door, right? Usually I'm not thinking. I just walk through it. But if I'm having problems with the handle, I don't just transparently walk through it and just cope with it. I now have to analyze it. I'm like, oh, geez, why won't the door open? Maybe it's locked, or maybe I'm pulling it the wrong way. I'm thinking about it in terms of presence at hand. What features are there? But then again, I'm sort of, that's maybe a bad example, because I'm still trying to get through the door, right? I'm just looking at how to do it, right? How to get through the door. And, for Heidegger, this self that we talk about is something that sort of flies in and out. It's not always there. In fact, most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, we lose ourselves in the world. And what does Heidegger mean when he talks about the world? He doesn't mean the earth, right? When Heidegger says that Dasein is always in the world, he doesn't mean in the earth, right? That would sound like, I'm in the earth, I'm half buried or something like that. And he doesn't mean the universe either. Right? Christians talk about the sins of the earth, the sins of the world. They don't talk about the sins of the universe. What is the world? For Heidegger, Heidegger, the world has to do with us. The world is the world that we create. It's the world, as Hannah Arendt says, it's the world of human artifice. The world we create. So the workshop of the carpenter is just one aspect of that world. You might hear people talking about the world of art, right? The art world, the fashion world, the world of sports, right? Or maybe the different sports, right? The world of NBA, the world of NFL, the world of NASCAR, right? But all of these worlds are just smaller worlds within the larger public world, right? And that's always an essential aspect of Dasein's existence, that Dasein always lives in the world, a world full of human meaning and human signification, and this is what gives their life meaning and signification. But really, what it really all boils down to, though, is whether or not I care. Because if I don't give a crap, if I don't care about anything at all, then what has any meaning? Nothing, says Heidegger, right? So, I've heard this referred to as the care structure, that it's all held together by care. Because I care, I'm using the hammer to build something. If I didn't care, I wouldn't do anything. I'd be just completely apathetic through it all, right? And this happens sometimes, Heidegger says, right? This is when things really go wrong. Imagine I've got this care structure where I'm focusing on marriage or something, and I'm engaged to be married. I've found the perfect woman. She's beautiful. She's intelligent. My parents like her. Her parents like me. It's all gonna be awesome. And then she leaves me like the day before the wedding for my best friend or something, right? So has anybody experienced heartbreak? Had their heart broken, torn into pieces? Don't want to admit to it. I have. So you might know what he's talking about, what Heidegger's talking about when he talks about angst, or in German Angst. The word angst, there was no English word. Now there is. But when he's writing this in 27, there wasn't. And I think it's pretty bad because they translated it as anxiety, which doesn't really work. Angst is better. Because Heidegger says you don't have angst about a certain thing. But you do have anxiety about something. I'm anxious about the test or whatever. But angst is where you no longer care. And that's kind of how you feel when you're devastated and you had your heart broken, right? You didn't give a crap about anything, right? Or maybe you just lost a loved one, right? Heck, I've lost a dog and felt this way, right? My dog Ty, he was always there. He's my buddy, man. And I didn't care. And people would, what do your friends do? They try to console you, right? Hey, it's all right, don't worry. The guy dumps you and they're just like, he was a jerk anyway, girl. You can do better than that. I think he flirted with me a couple times too. Yeah, I don't know about that. Right. So are you is that gonna make you feel happy now? No, you're still not gonna care, right? So this is where, for Heidegger, this is where the world starts to recede, where the world's still there, but it no longer has its significance. All that has sort of fallen apart. I mean, you see people doing things and acting like they care, but at the bottom, they're idiots, right? They don't know what it's just because they care that things matter, and you no longer care. You have that angst. And this, for Heidegger, is when we encounter the nothing. Another reason why analytic philosophers hate Heidegger, because he talks about nothing, Gesundheit. He talks about the nothing as if it were a thing. But I think he's talking about this experience, right, where you do feel this angst, where you have this sort of apathetic attitude where things just don't matter anymore. You don't care anymore, and literally there is nothing. You face das Nicht, right, das Nichtet. The nothing annihilates, as Heidegger says, right? And this is when we face up to our death, Heidegger says. When we feel this angst and we face up to the nothing, this is when we come face to face with our own most, as he puts it, our own death. Because for Heidegger, death is also something that we can't get around, right? The death is an essential factor of being a Dasein. If I'm Dasein, I know I will die, right? And it's sort of like the moment I exist, I could die at any moment, right? And I try, Heidegger says, in my everyday existence, I try to cover that up. I don't want to face up to that. I don't want to acknowledge the fact that at any moment, I could I could have like a heart attack right here. Wouldn't that be totally a trip if I did that while I was lecturing on Heidegger about this? But it could happen, right? But I don't want to say that. I don't want to acknowledge that. That's scary. Shut up. No, death is okay. And Heidegger seems to think, the things that we do when people die, when we give mourners some words of condolences or whatever, for him that's more of us comforting ourselves than it is comforting them, right? We're trying to sort of hide from this and trying not to face up to the fact that we have to die and we're alone in this, that no one can die for me. I mean, I guess I go, I die for you, but it's not like I'm on my deathbed. Hey man, I paid this guy $50. He said he was gonna die for me. Where is he at, man? I'm about to kick the bucket right now. He's supposed to be here for me. It doesn't work that way, right? There's no way around it, right? And we have to face up to this, and we only do usually in these moments of angst. And this is usually when things go horribly wrong, right? When things fall apart. Ironically, though, it also happens when things go well, too. Why would that be the case? Like, I get what I want. I win the contest. I get what I aimed at. Why would it happen then?
Because you can't believe you won $74 million.
Well, what were you going to say?
Coyote caught the roadrunner.
Yeah, well, you do what, you have this dream, I'm going to do this, and then everything's going to work out. And then you get it, and you're like, okay, now what? Now what, right? Or maybe it wasn't what I expected. I thought that when I got the career and the wife and the family, that I would be content. But I'm still a DOS sign. My being is still an issue for me. It always will be, as long as I'm here, right? And so even when I succeed, this is the case. And so this might occur. I might feel this angst, right? But normally what happens when we can't stay in this mood all the time, we get dumped, we're sad. Eventually we cheer up, right? We don't go to the extreme and do ourselves in, right? But eventually we lighten up, right? And Heidegger says that we can't really control this. I think that's one difference between him and Sartre. Sartre says, I'm responsible for my moods. I'm responsible for my passion. For Heidegger, no, they come and go. One time I'm happy, then all of a sudden I'm sad. It just comes out of nowhere, right? And when I feel these moods, Heidegger says, it tends to color my world. If I'm in a sad mood, the lights are sad. If I'm in a happy mood, the happy lights, So it sort of colors the world around me, my phenomena, if you will. And typically I'll run back to the shelter of what he calls das Mann, or the they, right? Das Mann is the German, and the they is a very loose translation. I mean, das Mann literally means the one in German, but it's not one as in the number one. It's more like a pronoun. They use it a lot in German. When you get advice from somebody in German, they always say, one must do this, right? One must bring an umbrella, right? I say, hey, it's going to rain outside. You should bring an umbrella. They say, man muss, bring an umbrella. One must bring an umbrella. In English, though, we do say they a lot. That's just what they say. That's what they told me. I remember working at Whole Foods or any other big corporation. You go in there and they're like, hey, we got a new special. We got to ring it up this way. You're like, that's a stupid way to do it. Why do they do it? I don't know. That's just what they told me to do. Who the heck is this they? Right? It's just this sort of norm that we kind of just fit into. Right? We just do what one does. We do what they say. Right? And for Heidegger, this is a way of escaping our responsibility, right? I'm just doing what one does, following the crowd. And there's a lot of controversy among Heidegger scholars. Some seem to think that he's critical of this attitude. Others seem to think, well, it's just a fact of life. There's no way around it. If you're going to have any identity, you just do what one does. Even if you're the rebel, even if you're, punk rock or whatever. I guess maybe when punk first came out, it was a little edgy, but after a while, there's norms, right? You rebel as one rebels, right? You have to wear your hair this certain way, or these sort of shoes, or whatever. And maybe that's not a bad thing, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have any sense of identity. You've got to follow the they self, but I guess you need to be aware that that's what you're doing when you do it. Some Heideggerians, and I disagree with them, believe that you can live permanently, authentically, which means permanently accepting yourself as a DOS sign and not falling into the they self. I think that's impossible, right? Because you're always going to follow some norm. That's just to me. I don't think Heidegger even says that you could. But this is very controversial, and if you read Heidegger, you'll see he's not easy to follow. So I guess it's easy to misinterpret him one way or the truly authentic is when you feel that angst, right? When things fall apart, and maybe certain moments, you have fleeting moments of authenticity, but for the most part, we all kind of do what one does, whatever that may be, and we follow the they. But anyways, that's about it for Heidegger. I guess we do have a little bit of time to get started on Sartre. I don't know how far we'll get, but let me make some room up here. Sartre's phenomenology is influenced by both Husserl and by Heidegger. I gave you just a short selection from a very long book of Sartre's. The name of the book, Being and Nothingness, or Le Continental, if you want to speak French, Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, I'm guessing here, maybe you guys can Google and help me out here, but I think 1906 to 1980, maybe 1904 to 1980, or 81, I can't remember. But anyway, we're close enough. Sartre's probably the youngest of the philosophers we'll be reading. I don't know, Arendt is maybe a little bit younger. We might get to her later on this semester, but he wrote this book, Being and Nothingness, in 1943. Many people saw this as a response to Heidegger. Right? The subtitle of this book is A Phenomenological Essay on Ontology. Phenomenological, so it's dealing with phenomenology. Phenomenological essay on ontology. Now, what the heck is ontology? We've seen that word before, but it's been a while. Ontology is...
he was inspired by Husserl.
I think Husserl and Heidegger. I think more leaning towards Heidegger, but he doesn't completely reject Husserl. Right? We'll get to the details of that if we have time. Certainly next time. But just for the time being, Sartre himself, he considered himself a phenomenologist when he's writing this book. But it would later be attributed to existentialism. That was the doctrine that they named after Sartre's philosophy. It's existentialism. He's an existentialist, and he sort of acquiesced and said, okay, sure, I guess I'm an existentialist, right? But when he's writing this, he's thinking of himself as a phenomenologist, right? He goes to study phenomenology in Germany, and he learns about Husserl and Heidegger, and he helps introduce phenomenology to France, right? There's another guy, Levinas, who also helps do this a bit, but Sartre had quite a big hand in it. And I think if that's all that Sartre had ever done, was bring phenomenology to France, that itself would be pretty significant, because phenomenology is still pretty influential in French intellectual circles. But some people think of Being and Nothingness as a way of improving Heidegger. They think that Sartre read Heidegger and says, I like him, but he's wrong about a few things, and I'm going to improve them. Other people think that Sartre just misunderstood Heidegger. He didn't really see where he was coming from, right? I tend to think that it's probably both are a little bit true. I mean, he read Heidegger in the original German. The guy's a Frenchman. Reading Heidegger in your own language is pretty hard. I can't imagine reading it in another language, right? So, and I've read a lot of Being and Nothingness, and there's passages where I think he's right on. He knows exactly what Heidegger's saying. He didn't misunderstand him. But then there's other passages where I think it's pretty obvious that he did, especially when Sartre talks about death and all this analysis of death. But what has he got going on here in Being and Nothingness? He starts off the book not by disagreeing with Heidegger, but by disagreeing with Husserl a bit. Remember, Husserl was focusing on consciousness, and Heidegger was focusing on being. And Heidegger thought that if I analyze Dasein, I'll get closer to being. Why? Because Dasein has this special relation with being. Right? Being is always an issue for it. Right? So we have to figure out Dasein first, and then we'll figure out being in general. So Sartre agrees with Heidegger. Look, we've got to focus on this question of being. That's what ontology does. Ontology is the study of being. Phenomenology needs to do this. And Husserl was wrong. For a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons Husserl's wrong is he didn't really live up to his own principles. Remember, Husserl says that consciousness is intentional, and Sartre agrees. Yes, consciousness is intentional, Husserl. Consciousness is always consciousness of something as something. Remember, so that's what he means by intentionality. Sartre says, you're right, Husserl, consciousness is always of something as something, but being is implicit throughout that whole structure, right? Consciousness is, right? Consciousness has being, it is, and it's always conscious of something, material, experience, the materials of experience, right? Those things are, right? This is. How it is, I don't know. That's what he's going to analyze, but it certainly is. And it's always presented as a type of thing. I see all this phenomenon as a house. I see all this phenomenon as a classroom full of students. This is a valuation on what is. Right? So as Sartre puts it, being is implicit throughout this whole structure. Consciousness, experience is penetrated with being. It's a plenum of being, as Sartre puts it. So if we're going to do phenomenology and we're going to look at consciousness and conscious experience, Sartre says there are a couple of questions that we do have to ask about being. What are these questions? I'll give you the questions and explain them to you. Don't know if we'll have time to get his answers, though, today. The questions that he asks, he says, first off, what is the phenomenon of being? What is the phenomenon of being? When I say that something is, or it has being, what does that mean? What is that phenomenon? How can I describe it? And secondly, what is the being of the phenomena? Remember, that's phenomenon in the plural. So what he's asking here is, what is it that allows all these different phenomena, a marker, a desk, me, what allows them to be? Right? What is the essence of them? What is the being of those phenomena out there? Right? What is the phenomenon of being? What does it mean to be? And what makes things have that phenomenon, have that quality of being? Right? These are the questions that he wants to answer. And he thinks he's got an answer for them. Right? One thing he says is that I typically know things. I have knowledge or understanding of objects in respect of other objects through an act of negation. I know objects in respect of other objects through an act of negation. What that means is to know that this is a chair, to look at this as a chair and see it as a chair. I have to isolate it from all the other objects around it and negate those objects, right? This chair is not the floor that it's sitting on. It's not the desk that it's sitting in front of. It's not the air particles that are around it. It's not the room. It's not all of you. It's just this chair, right? So these objects are known by negation, right? I negate everything else besides this object, but what is the basis for this negation? Sartre says we are. The subject, the ego, the subjectivity, we are the origin, he says, of negation. We bring nothingness into the world. And by negating, we allow things to be. I negate everything besides the chair, a chair emerges and it has being. Right? And when I do this negating, it's not just some logical operation that I do in my head like a robot. For Sartre, it has normative value. I'm expressing a norm. When I call this a chair, that has normative connotations. How can he say that? I just called it a chair. What's so normative about that? I mean, couldn't I call it I could call it a zebra, couldn't I? Sartre says I could. I am radically free to do what I will with this. Call it a zebra, sure. How far am I going to get with that one, though? Not very far, right? I'm going to go buy a new zebra and take it back to my house, and it's going to match all my other zebras. Telling my friend about my new zebra that I got. It's a great zebra. It's real comfortable, you know. It's not too soft, you know, but not too firm. You can lean back. It's a recliner. It's one of those reclining zebras, right? And it's got like a little cup holder. You know what I'm talking about?
No,
No, it's absurd, right? So I call it a chair, that's expressing a norm. I'm playing the game that everybody else is playing. Okay, I'll call it a chair, that's what one does, we call it a chair, right? So my judgments aren't just I'm negating and classifying things and separating them. No, they have norms attached to them as well, says Sartre. And I'm also able to detect a lack of being. I can sense that things are not there. Anybody go grocery shopping here? No? Yeah, you go grocery shopping. Do you make a list? You do? You make a list? So when you're making a list, I make a list. When you're making a list, before you go to the grocery store, what do? You look in your fridge, your pantry, and all that stuff. Well, what are you looking for? You're looking for what's not there. Right? You're looking for a nothingness as part. So you're looking for a négativité, as Sartre would say in the French, right? You're looking for a lack of being, that something lacks being there that needs to be there. It's like when you go meet your friend at a bar or a cafe or something. You're going to meet them and they're not there. You notice their absence, right? You notice that they're not there. And for Sartre, we're the only ones that do this. That our consciousness allows us to do this because we are the origin of negation. But what is the self? When he talks about a self or consciousness or ego, what does Sartre say? Well, for him, the self is nothing, as he puts it. Right? That's another thing analytic philosophers hate. We understand ourselves by negation. Remember, I understand objects by negation. I know that this chair is not all the other things around it. Okay, well, let's apply that procedure to ourselves. Sartre would say, well, I'm not the chair, and I'm not all of you, and I'm not all the air around me, and I'm not even my body, he would say. I'm not even my physical form, right? I'm not. I'm basically a negation of everything that I experience, right? What's that?
It's original. I mean, something original would have nothing. That would be it.
Well, he does believe that we're all original, we're all unique, but the self known by negation for him is just an empty concept. It does need to be filled in, but and for him this is only one aspect of the self. Next class we'll get a good full definition of the for itself. Remember I gave you that last time, didn't I? The for itself and the in itself. The for itself, this is what he's going to call the self. But he's got a very wacky definition for it that really needs to be unpacked and really explained. We've already got the groundwork for it, basically. So